Welcome to the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology's exhibition, Charles Fletcher Lummis, Photos of the American Southwest. I was after neither time nor money, but life. Life in the truer, broader, sweeter sense. The exhilarant joy of living outside the sorry fences of society. Such were the motivations penned by Charles Fletcher Lummis about his 3,507-mile walk from Cincinnati westward in his book, A Tramp Across the Continent. The trek took 143 days, and Lummis arrived in his new home of Los Angeles, California at midnight on February 1st, 1885, dressed the part of eccentric frontiersman. The photo archive holds roughly 100,000 plus photographs dating from the 1860s through the present. The main feature of this exhibition, Loomis's Cyanotype photo album, is part of the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology's Photo Archive. These ethnographic and archaeological images are mostly from the southwestern United States, and New Mexico in particular. Some photographs in the Maxwell Archive are also found in other photo archives around the world, but many are unique to the Maxwell, and some are previously unknown and unpublished. Lummis was one of the 20th century's great polymaths. He was a writer, he was an editor, a journalist, publisher, archaeologist, ethnographer, librarian, museum founder, conservationist, an advocate for Native American rights, a promoter of the American Southwest, and, of greatest interest here, a photographer. Lummis was born in Massachusetts and mostly was homeschooled in his youth. By the time he attended Harvard in 1877, he was fluent in French, Latin, and Greek. In his junior year, he married Dorothea Dock Rhodes, but soon after he had a child to another woman out of wedlock. Shortly after graduating, Lummis dropped out of college and moved to Ohio to work on his father-in-law's farm. Eventually, he began writing poetry and became editor of the local newspaper. Lummis's trek, while renowned, was not the first across the continent. John Muir, American naturalist and conservationist, who would become an acquaintance of Lummis, first trekked across the continent some 16 years before him. Early in the 1880s, Lummis conceived of his own plan to walk across America. Describing his motivations, Lummis says, "I am an American and feel ashamed to know so little of my country as I did, and as most Americans do." And thus, he chose to walk west and relocate to the California coast. Lummis describes the experience as a chance to kill several birds with one stone, to learn more of the country and its people than railroad travel could ever teach, and to have the physical joy which only the confirmed pedestrian knows. He planned to fund his adventure by writing about his trek in a weekly series published in the Chillicothe Leader newspaper in Ohio and the Los Angeles Times. This series sparked his later interest in becoming the first city editor for the LA Times. The encounters and exploits were often exaggerated, but thrilling nonetheless. He encountered savage animals, dogs, wolves, coyotes, and snakes, often dispatching such foes with only his hunting knife. He withstood tremendous weather, like drenching rain or the ghastly heat of the desert and the freezing cold. But ultimately, he fell in love with the landscape, and these experiences had a transformative effect. Lummis's walk across the country also impacted his views on race. He had ideas of masculinity and race that led him and many of his contemporaries to believe that the East was, quote, industrial, urban, elitist, ethnically heterogeneous, and racially mixed, while the West was ideal in relation to masculinity and race because it was, quote, agrarian, rural, egalitarian, and ethnically and racially homogeneous, according to historian G. Edward White. As Lummis's accounts in A Tramp reveal, he began his trek with many racist views, using shockingly derogatory language to describe people of other races he encountered along the way. But these views changed as he encountered diverse individuals and groups during his walk and during his time on the West Coast. through his views would change dramatically, motivating him to become a defender of minority groups like Mexicans, Nuevo Mexicanos, Tejanos, Californianos, Chinese, and Native Americans. He still retained his own racialized hierarchies within and between cultural groups. Interestingly, he took the side of the oppressed with mixed results. As editor for the LA Times and in his role as editor of the journal Land of Sunshine and in other writings, he wrote against assimilationist views and opposed Indian boarding schools. In 1893, he founded the Landmarks Club, a cultural preservation organization, and in 1900, he founded the Sequoia League, an organization supporting Native Americans. Even still, he was not necessarily liked or trusted by Native peoples. It was one of his earlier encounters with Native Americans that spurred his interest in photography. In 1886, the LA Times sent him to Arizona to report on the American campaign against the Apaches. During that campaign, the Americans captured the Apache leader known as Geronimo. This event greatly affected Loomis, and equally impactful was his encounter with photographer Camillus S. Fly, who photographed the captured Geronimo. Loomis collected many of Fly's photographs, and in that same year, Loomis bought his own camera. He began to take pictures in the fall of 1886 while traveling around New Mexico with his first wife. The couple published stories of their travels through New Mexico in the LA Times as The Adventures of Lum and Doc in Injun Country. Loomis took 87 dry plate images in New Mexico. During the time Loomis picked up a camera, photography was becoming more simple than it was even a few years earlier with the creation of gelatin plate photography. This new photographic technology required less equipment, allowing photographers to mobilize their work and making the creation of multiple prints much cheaper, quicker, and easier. Loomis kept up a hectic work schedule, leading to his suffering of a stroke in 1887, which left him temporarily paralyzed on one side. So on the advice of his friend and Harvard classmate Teddy Roosevelt, he went to the remote forested area of San Mateo, New Mexico to stay with the family of Manuel Antonio Chavez, with whom he became good friends, and where he stayed to recover. Loomis had met the Chavez family on his trek and stayed with them for some months. During his second stay, Loomis had been removed from the payroll of the LA Times and was scraping by, selling occasional letters to his former employer for $1.50 each. And though still partially paralyzed, Loomis still rode horseback to observe the landscape and the Nuevo Mexicano and Native American inhabitants of the area. He brought his Dallmeyer lens, camera, and the tripod kit with him. In March of 1888, while out riding, Loomis heard an uncanny whistling sound, which he described as being like the wail of a tortured soul. He soon learned it came from a small wooden flute known as a pito, or pitero. The instrument was used in a Good Friday mortification ritual by the penitentes, a secretive all-male Catholic sect and brotherhood known specifically to this region of northern New Mexico. They didn't allow any photographs or witnesses to their practices, but Loomis met with their leaders and persuaded them to allow him to photograph their ceremonies. Loomis sold accounts and photographs of the group to media outlets around the country, including the LA Times, the Boston Transcript, and the Cosmopolitan. Loomis was also investigating and reporting on murder and corruption by local politicians in San Mateo. This, along with his reporting on the penitentes, earned him a price on his head, and the occasional gunshot was taken. As a result, he moved to the pueblo of Isleta 100 miles away. There, he rented a house on the Abeda family compound. They were a prominent family on the pueblo. While at Isleta, Loomis divorced his first wife and married Frances Eve Douglas, the sister-in-law of an English trader who also lived on the pueblo. Loomis increased his photography production by teaching his wife Eve how to make cyanotype prints. Cyanotypes, with their telling blue tint, are fairly unstable and fade easily over time, but were easy and cheap to make. Cyanotypes were also possible to process in the dim light of an adobe, and was tolerant of impurities in New Mexico well water. Loomis earned far much more money from selling his photographs than from his writing. 8 blueprints sold for $1 compared with $2.90 for 13 pieces of Acoma pottery and $6 for a first-class Acoma serape. During this period, Loomis began photographing the same people and places he wrote about, submitting photographic print portfolios like the one here to accompany submissions of his writings. Loomis also sold thousands of individual postcard prints to Wilbur Campbell, a Los Angeles-based dealer in pioneer curios. Though he lived at the pueblo of Isleta during his time in New Mexico, he took photographs of other pueblos and sites as well, such as these images of the pueblo of Taos, or this image of the church at the pueblo of Laguna. By April of 1892, when Loomis left Isleta, he noted in his diary that he and his wife had made 19,526 blueprints in New Mexico to date. At this time, Loomis also recorded on wax cylinder many songs from New Mexican villages and sheep herding camps. These recordings are now part of the Autry Museum of the American West collection. Loomis returned to Los Angeles and began working with the journal Land of Sunshine, later known as Out West, where he continued to grow his interest in photography. While in California, he would undertake even more projects, including the founding of the Southwest Society, a branch of the Archaeological Institute of America, and establishing and building the Southwest Museum, which is now part of the Autry Museum of the American West. In 1901, Ford Harvey, the president of the Fred Harvey Company, which was famed for its hospitality and railroad business in the American Southwest, and son of its founder Fred Harvey, invited Loomis to guide a railroad excursion traveling to the Grand Canyon for a group of Santa Fe Railroad executives. That included Santa Fe Railroad President Ed Ripley. During that trip, Loomis convinced the executives not to build a hotel on the canyon's south rim, which had been their aim. Loomis, as a conservationist, argued that it would be an utter defilement of the natural wonder. An individual in the group borrowed his camera and snapped this picture of him, Ford, and 2 railroad executives dangling their legs over the canyon rim. It would seem Loomis's connection with this trip and the Harvey family is connected to the Maxwell Lummis album. The album was donated to the Maxwell Museum in 1970 by Byron Harvey III, who was Ford Harvey's grandnephew. And although it is not certain, it is likely Ford was given the album or purchased it from Loomis himself. While the Maxwell Museum does not have a large collection of photographs by Charles Loomis, it is nevertheless a significant collection. The Maxwell Loomis photographs consist of some loose photographs of Chaco Canyon that Loomis took during the 1901 railway trip and this Cyanotype album. The album, in its uniqueness of assembly, as no 2 of Loomis's Cyanotype albums are exactly alike, is a revealing window into a dense history, a biography of sorts of Charles Loomis himself, and a unique history of the American Southwest.